Well, good evening, everybody. Um, Whoa, it looks like we've got over 250 people in the room already. My name is Mike Busch, and as Chad said, I'm a maintenance columnist for EAA Sport Aviation since the magazine was recast in January of 2010. Um, and these days, I spend most of my time running a company called Savvy Aircraft Maintenance Management Inc. That does professional maintenance management of owner-flown piston aircraft. Um, Among other things, my company has managed more than 500 annual inspections over the last 3.5 years, so we've had pretty much everything that can go right or wrong during an annual inspection go right or wrong under our purview. Nowadays, we're managing about 300 annual inspections per year. Almost, it's getting close to one a day now. So we do a lot of this stuff. We're going to be talking about a lot of stuff. I'm going to try to go through this rapidly. This webinar is loosely based on on a talk that I normally give on the Forums Plaza at AirVenture, at least the last couple of years. It's an hour and a quarter talk on the Forums Plaza. I suspect that that Chad and Charlie would like me to do it a little quicker than an hour and a quarter, so I will see what I can do. But there's a lot of stuff to talk about. Choosing the shop to have the annual done, what the basic steps are in conducting an annual inspection, how an aircraft owner should manage the annual to keep things under control and avoid surprises. Some of the documents and that we need to manage an annual properly. The issue of controlling costs, and specifically how and when to say no to things to try to keep costs under control. We're going to go through some of the key regulations that affect annual inspections, that define what we're required to do and what things we're not required to do. Talk a little bit about how an annual inspection ends. It ends with one of two kinds of logbook entries that we'll take a look at. And finally, a few words about how to resolve owner-mechanic disputes if you and the inspecting IA wind up disagreeing over something in the course of the annual inspection. So let's plunge right into it and start off by talking about how to choose the right shop. My experience is that aircraft owners frequently choose the shop to do their annual for wrong reasons and often omit right reasons. They typically choose a shop because it's located conveniently. It may be a manufacturer authorized service center. The mechanic or director of maintenance seems like a friendly enough guy, has a nice smile. But we really need to do a lot more due diligence in choosing the shops that we use to do annual inspections. And in our managed maintenance program, one of the more important things we do is help our owners choose the best shops to have their inspections done at. We often see owners making decisions based on who has the lowest shop rate. That's probably the worst possible way to choose a shop. And oh, by the way, the shop rate and the invoice total typically have no correlation with one another whatsoever. We do a lot of cirruses. Almost 2/3 of the aircraft that we manage are cirruses. We manage about 7% of the cirrus fleet worldwide right now. And we work with literally all the cirrus service centers in the country. There are 145 cirrus service centers in the U.S. And they range all the way from wonderful shops to be avoided at all costs and everything in the middle. So just because a shop is a cirrus service center doesn't mean it's a good place to take your cirrus. And that's true of every make and model. We really need to interview these shops very, very carefully, much as you would before you hired a new employee. We like very much to avoid doing an annual with a shop we've never worked in, but rather worked with before, but rather try them out on some small tasks like an oil change or a tire change or something, to find out um, whether the shop is one that is going to be good to work with before we commit to doing an annual inspection there. We don't always get to do that, but if we can possibly avoid doing an annual at a shop we've never done anything else with before, we prefer to avoid that, because again, you really don't want surprises, bad surprises happening in the middle of an annual inspection. To kind of net down what we look for when we're evaluating a shop, I call it the 3 C's. We're looking for competence, we're looking for good communications, and we're looking for cooperation. Competence means that the shop has extensive experience with your particular make and model. You know, just because a shop is very good with, say, Cirruses, we would not take a Cessna P210 there for an annual. We need a shop that has extensive experience with your particular make and model, or what we like to call high time and type on the part of the mechanics. Communication is absolutely critical. You cannot manage an annual unless the shop is willing to keep you in the information loop and allow you to make decisions wherever decisions are required. Many shops are very good at communications, others are very bad. Shops that take the attitude, you know, you hired us to do the annual, now go away and leave us alone and let us do our job, are simply not shops that we can deal with, because decision making needs to be done by the owner, not by the mechanic. And if the mechanics don't keep the owner in the loop, in the information loop, then the owner can't do his job of making maintenance decisions. And finally, cooperation. We look for shops that understand that the airplane belongs to the owner, and that where decisions are to be made to the maximum extent possible, the maintenance should be done the way the owner wants it to be done, not the way the mechanic thinks it should be done. The owner it should be in control. The shop is basically hired help that the owner has engaged to help him comply with his obligations under the FARs, and it's very important that the shop understand that the owner is supposed to be calling the shots, not the shop, and we'll talk about that in a lot more detail. The sequence of events in an annual inspection is basically this. It's a sequential series of steps that should occur on every annual inspection. First, open the aircraft, meaning remove the cowlings and fairings and inspection plates and seats and carpets and floorboards and so on, to render the airplane in an inspectable condition. The second step is to do the actual inspection part of the inspection, that is to inspect the physical aircraft and also to inspect the maintenance records. Both of those have to be done in an annual, and on occasion, if the maintenance records are in particularly terrible shape, it may take more time to inspect the maintenance records and get them cleaned up than to inspect the aircraft. Hopefully that won't be true in your case, but it's really important to keep the maintenance records in good, well-organized, complete shape, so that the inspection of logbooks that is required to be done at every annual inspection does not take an inordinate amount of time.
Mike, can I break in here just for a second? Somebody asked a question, what is DOM? I missed part of the conversation.
DOM is Director of Maintenance.
Thank you.
Okay. The third step, which is actually done during the inspection, is to create a discrepancy list. Simply a list of everything that was found wrong with the aircraft in the course of the discrepancy, in the course of the inspection. And as we'll see when we look at some discrepancy lists, it's extremely important that each discrepancy that is listed be clearly identified as whether it's an airworthiness item or not. An airworthiness item means a discrepancy that rises to the level that the inspecting mechanic feels that he will not be able to sign off the annual with an approval for return to service unless that particular discrepancy is corrected. A non-airworthiness discrepancy is simply a problem that the mechanic has identified, recommends be resolved, but if the owner decides not to take action on it, that will not cause the mechanic to be unable to approve the aircraft return to service. So it's very, very important that when you get a discrepancy list from the inspecting mechanic, the discrepancies are clearly identified as to which ones are airworthiness issues and which aren't. And in my experience, 60 to 80% of all discrepancies are non-airworthiness items that the owner can freely choose to repair or not to repair at his discretion without creating a problem with getting the annual signed off. Step 4, we repair the discrepancies. We repair presumably all of the airworthiness items and usually at least some subset of the non-airworthiness items. Preventive maintenance is typically performed during the course of an annual inspection. Things like changing the oil filter, greasing the wheel bearings, that sort of stuff. There's no requirement to do preventive maintenance during an annual inspection. It just happens to usually be a convenient time to do it because the aircraft is down and because the aircraft is opened up. Finally, after the repairs and the preventive maintenance is completed, the aircraft gets closed up, meaning the floorboards and carpets and seats and fairings and cowlings and stuff go back on. The inspector makes the required logbook entries, which we'll take a look at, and presents an invoice to the owner. So that's the sequence of events that happens during annual inspection. And there's a very important point in that sequence right here, what I call a decision point, which occurs after the inspection part of the inspection is completed and the discrepancy list has been prepared, but before any discrepancies are repaired. And that's the point where if the aircraft owner is going to affect the outcome, that's where he has to do it. It's the owner's job to review the discrepancy list and then go back to the get any questions answered that he needs to get answered, and frequently there'll be a lot of questions at this point. And then when he fully understands the situation, go back to the shop and say, here's what I want you to do, here's what I want you not to do. And again, we'll see a bunch of examples of that, but this is the decision point. If the owner isn't heavily involved in the inspection right at this decision point, then he's not going to be able to affect the outcome, and he's basically going to be a bystander, which is not what we want. So in order to make sure that the owner is involved at the decision point, we divide the annual into 3 phases. The first phase is the inspection phase, which the service center normally does at an agreed-to flat rate, as opposed to doing it on time and materials. Almost every shop will agree to do the inspection part of an inspection, of an annual inspection, for an agreed-to flat rate. So there won't be any surprises as to what the inspection part of the inspection costs. And the inspection culminates with the preparation of a work order that contains a detailed discrepancy list and specific repair recommendations with specific cost estimates for each one. The second phase is the review and approval phase. At this point, the responsibility transitions from the shop to the aircraft owner, and the owner reviews the discrepancy list and cost repair estimates in detail, asks whatever questions he needs to ask, consults whatever outside experts he feels like consulting, and ultimately winds up giving the service center specific direction as to which items he wants repaired and which items he doesn't want repaired. And then finally, in phase 3, responsibility passes back from the owner to the shop, and the owner performs the repairs as the aircraft owner has directed, and ultimately submits an invoice and prepares logbook entries approving the aircraft for return to service. So this 3-phase protocol is the way we ensure that the aircraft owner is involved at the decision point and gets to make the decisions that he needs to make. Here are some examples of work orders from and various shops have work orders that look different because they use different softwares. Occasionally, we will still see these work orders prepared by hand, but nowadays, most shops of any decent size have a good computerized work order management system, and wind up presenting work orders that are nice and easy to read and formatted, and here's an example of one. And the thing I've kind of boxed with little red boxes are the indications for each. First of all, notice that each item is numbered so that we can refer to these items by number easily when we go back to the shop and say what we want to approve, what we want to decline. And second of all, that each of the items is identified as to whether it's an airworthiness item, a recommended item, a preventive maintenance item. In this case, item 13 is marked customer declined because the customer already said that he didn't want to clean the fuel injectors for good reason. Here's another segment of a work order, again showing how the various items are clearly identified, or should be clearly identified, as whether they're airworthiness items that the shop feels must be addressed, or whether they're recommended items that are at the discretion of the owner. Here's another one uses a different software package, but again, each item is numbered and each item is clearly identified as whether it's an airworthiness item or not. At the conclusion of the owner's review and due diligence, the owner would then come back to the shop with specific direction as to what items he approves, what repairs he approves to have done, and what items he declines. This is an example of one case where we consulted with the owner and then went back to the shop, giving an enumerated list of items to be performed and an enumerated list of items that are declined. Here's another example where the shop presented its discrepancy list as an Excel spreadsheet, and after consulting with the owner, we annotated the spreadsheet to indicate which items are declined and which are approved, and sent the annotated spreadsheet back to the shop. Again, here's an example of a list of manufacturer recommended time-directed items that the shop presented us, and again, in consultation with the owner, we went through and crossed off the ones that we didn't want done, and sent the annotated list back to the shop. So that there are various ways of doing this, but basically the idea is the shop provides recommendations, the owner goes over those recommendations and decides which ones to accept and which ones to decline. One of the things we often run into at shops that is totally unacceptable, where we have to work kind of hard to get them to follow reasonable protocols, is where instead of completing the inspection first and providing a discrepancy list and waiting for the owner to give approvals or disapprovals, the shop will fix things as it goes along. It will inspect a little and fix a little and inspect a little and fix a little and so on. That's very convenient for the shop, but it is a total disaster for the aircraft owner, because by not segregating the inspection from the repair phase, the shop basically prevents there ever from being a decision point where the owner can go in, review the inspection findings, and make decisions as to what he wants done and what he doesn't want done. And so by doing this inspect a little, fix a little thing, which is something that we find quite commonly in shops that we haven't had a chance to train, if you will, the owner is precluded from carrying out his part of the responsibility, and the decisions wind up being made by the shop rather than the owner. And when decisions are made by mechanics rather than owners, those decisions frequently will not be what the owner would want to do or what's in the owner's best interest. Let me give you a couple of examples of situations that we run into. This was one that I happened to find on the Cirrus Owners and Pilots Association forums a couple of years ago, where a Cirrus owner just got the invoice back on the first annual on his airplane since it was out of warranty. And during the first couple of years, the airplane was under warranty, and Cirrus wound up paying for everything. And then, of course, there's that come to Jesus moment where the airplane goes out of warranty, and all of a sudden, the invoice winds up going to the aircraft owner. And the aircraft owner posted the invoice to the COPA forum and was decrying the fact that it was a $12,000 annual, and he was very, very upset that it was so expensive. And I started to go through this invoice that he posted, and I found it, kind of interesting. And let's just walk through it very quickly. The first item on the invoice, as always, was a flat rate annual inspection. The shop charged a little less than $2,000 for the annual, which is right on target. At that time, a normally aspirated Cirrus SR22 annual flat rate was 23 hours, and that's exactly what they charged him at a shop rate of $84 an hour, which was quite reasonable for the location where the shop was based. The next item was that they inspected the ELT and verified the battery date, and they charged him an extra hour for that. Well, I found that kind of peculiar, because since every annual inspection is required to include an ELT inspection, that item should have really been part of the flat rate, and it should not have been split out separately. It's an $84 item. It's not worth having a big fight about, but it wasn't right. Had we been managing it, we would have asked the shop why that item was split out separately instead of being covered by the flat rate. The next item was to replace the brake O-rings, which Cirrus had recommended doing every year, $465 for the parts and labor. Replacing the brake O-rings is a stupid thing to do. We always decline that item on every Cirrus, and in fact, well, this was a couple of years ago, but over the last couple of years, we persuaded Cirrus that it was a stupid thing to do, and they've taken it off their checklist. But back then, it was still on their checklist, but it was still a stupid thing to do. And had we been consulting with this owner, we would have told him to decline that item. It's just doesn't. There's no reason to do it, and it's just, $500 thrown away. The next item was another hour to swing the compass. Why would you need to hire an A&P to swing your compass? This is the wet compass. This is something an owner can do himself. If he, just taxi over to the compass rose. If the compass is significantly off, then the owner may want to get the A&P to readjust the compass. But a compass swing is something that an owner can perfectly well do for himself, and there's no good reason to be paying a shop to do it. The next item was to replace all the hoses, the flexible, flammable fluid carrying hoses. Cirrus recommends doing this every 5 years. It's about $1,000. For our clients, we look at if the aircraft is hangared and whether it's operated on a regular basis. And if it's hangared and operated regularly, then we typically suggest that the client let the hoses go to 8 to 10 years instead of replacing them every 5 years. 5 years is a absolutely worst case recommendation meant for airplanes that sit out in the open in a corrosive environment and aren't flown very often, and we would have declined that or deferred it for several more years. But again, the owner accepted it blindly. The next one is a prop overhaul. Again, Hartzell recommends overhauling the prop every 6 years. We recommend not doing anything if the aircraft is hangared and operated regularly. When the prop gets out to 10 or 12 years, we'll recommend a reseal repair, which is about half the cost of an overhaul. But overhauling the prop every 6 years is, in our view, a complete waste of money, and we would have declined that item. Then things really start to get interesting. The next item is lubricate the prop, a 1-year item for $42. Well, that would be fine, except that the prop was just overhauled. Why would you lubricate a freshly overhauled prop? Then the next item is dress, prime, and paint the prop for $252. Again, this is a prop that just came back from the overhaul shop. It's just been freshly painted and so on. Why on earth would that be on the invoice? Well, if you think about it for a moment, it's probably pretty obvious why it was on the invoice, because the shop probably lubed the prop, dress, primed, and painted the prop, and then somebody noticed in the logbook that the prop was due for a 6-year overhaul, and then they sent it out to the prop shop. So clearly the owner should not have had to pay for the lube and the dress, prime, and paint if he was paying for the prop overhaul. Again, we would have declined the overhaul, but since the owner didn't, he certainly shouldn't have been billed for those other items. Clearly, nobody was watching the store here. This just showed up on the invoice. The owner paid it, and then he posted to the Cirrus forums and was complaining about why it was so expensive. The next item, number 3, spark plug is undergaffed, replaced for $120. What's an undergaffed spark plug? Spark plugs, gaffs grow in service. The only way a spark plug can be undergaffed is if a mechanic is trying to gap it and goes overboard and makes the gap too small, at which point you have to throw the spark plug away. Well, if that happened, that shouldn't be the owner's responsibility. That should be the shop's responsibility. So this is another item on the invoice that we would have pushed back and said, no, the owner shouldn't have to pay for that. Next one was a screw was missing from the right-hand wingtip, which they charged an hour for. Again, the wingtip had to come off for the annual inspection, so whether the screw was missing or not should not have affected the labor at all. That's an item that should have never been on the invoice. And the invoice went on, and there was about another $6,000 worth of stuff. But this was clearly an annual that where the owner did no due diligence, did no management, did not get involved in making decisions as to what to be done, what not to be done, and certainly did not scrutinize the invoice. He just paid it and then complained that it was very, very high. In my view, the owner wasn't doing his job here. Maintenance, and particularly annual inspections, need to be managed actively. You can't just hand the keys to the shop and say, call me when you're done and I'll pay your invoice. You've got to be more involved than that. Otherwise, you're not going to be happy with the outcome. We'll go through another example very quickly, or as quickly as I can. This one was very interesting. It was probably the furthest over the top annual I've ever seen on a Cirrus aircraft. This owner has a 2003 SR-22 that he flew a lot, 250 to 300 hours a year. He basically commuted to work in it, and he had, since the warranty had expired, he'd been having the annuals done at a particular Cirrus service center and typically getting invoices in the $5,000 to $6,000 range. And for reasons that I don't totally understand, in 2010 he decided to use a different Cirrus service center, one that he'd never used before and one that he had clearly not done any due diligence on. This particular service center was one that there had been so many complaints about that literally the week he put his airplane in the shop, Cirrus revoked the service center's Cirrus authorization. But the owner didn't really do any due diligence. He just put this airplane in the shop and then decided to go off on a business trip to India. And a couple of weeks later, he's in Mumbai, and he gets an email from the shop containing the discrepancy list and estimate. And and it included 89 discrepancies and nearly a $25,000 bottom line. Obviously, the owner was quite aghast when he received this, and he emailed me and said, "Can you help?" which is when I got involved in it. But $25,000 for an annual inspection on a Cirrus is way out of the envelope, obviously. So he emailed us the work order. We started going through it, and here's a quick summary of what we found on this work order. There was an inspection flat rate of $3,600, which is, as you now know, about 150% of what it should have been. $2,400 might have been reasonable, but certainly not $3,600. But he'd already agreed to this, and the inspection part of the inspection had already been done, so he was sort of stuck with paying the $3,600. Now we got into all of the discrepancies and repair recommendations on the work order. And as you can see, there's a whole slew of 5-year recommended items: flex hose replacement for $1,900, fuel drain valve seals for $180, gascolator seals $150, aileron rudder shock cord $160, a 500-hour recommended alternator number 1 replacement for $1,440, a 1,700-hour alternator 2 overhaul for $790. All of these are items that we would decline. And also notice that they were all way at the top of the range. For example, you remember on the previous Cirrus SR22 we looked at, the 5-year flex hose replacement was quoted at $900 and some odd dollars, and on this one it was quoted at $1,900. So they must have been proposing to use gold-plated hoses or something. The 6-year propeller overhaul for $3,720. A 4-year overhaul of magnetos for $1,700, 2-year main battery replacement $700, 2-year TKS anti-ice filter replacement $320, annual fuel injector nozzle cleaning $200. The shop indicated that the TKS de-ice boots on the propeller were starting to crack, and they proposed to replace them for $860. That the lower cowling had heat damage, and they proposed to repair it for $940. Wing root fairing caps were disbonding. They proposed to replace those for $950. Muffler flame cones were warped, and they proposed to replace the mufflers with new ones at $2,280. To replace the current 121.5 ELT with a 406 megahertz unit for $1,750. Miscellaneous cosmetic and paint touch-up for $1,620, and about 50 additional minor squawks for about $1,425, for a grand total of nearly $25,000. Now notice, and this is all of those items stacked up in one stack, that all of the items that I've circled in red are ones that there's nothing wrong with. They're not actually discrepancies. They're simply timed recommended items that the manufacturer is recommending doing replacement or overhaul or something at a particular time. But there's nothing wrong. The inspection didn't find that the flex hoses were bad, or the drain valve seals were leaking, or the aileron rudder shock cord was damaged. These are all items that didn't have any inspection finding of an airworthiness, but were simply timed manufacturer recommendations. Only the items that were not circled here, like the de-ice boots cracking and the heat damage on the cowling and so on, were actual inspection findings where there was something found to be awry. So what do we recommend the owner do? We recommend that the owner say no to most of those items that were boxed, where there wasn't actually anything found wrong. And let me go into a little bit about our thinking on this before we go into the specifics of how we resolve this issue for the owner. We're strong believers in the philosophy called reliability-centered maintenance, which I've done webinars on, which is the philosophy that the that the air transport industry, the airlines, have used since the 70s, that the military has used since the 80s, and frankly nowadays the only part of aviation that doesn't use this approach is owner-flown GA, low-end GA, like where we are. And one of the goals of my writing and my management company and the classes I teach and the webinars I give is to try to drag general aviation maintenance kicking and screaming into the 21st century, where we use the same fundamental maintenance approaches that the big boys have used for decades. But one of the fundamental philosophies of reliability-centered maintenance is that maintenance is not inherently a good thing. The more maintenance we do is not necessarily better. Usually it's worse. We look at maintenance a lot like surgery. Sometimes we have to do it, but we don't want to do any more than necessary. Not only is more maintenance not necessarily better, but usually it's worse. And the reason it's worse is that if we let a mechanic do something that doesn't need to be done, there's the possibility that he'll screw it up. Frankly, the vast majority of equipment failures that we have in airplanes is not because the components are old and deteriorating. It's because either there's an infant mortality failure in something that's young as opposed to old, or there's a maintenance-induced failure by a mechanic that took something apart, put it back together, and didn't put it back together right. And maintenance-induced failures are a very, very large portion of the failures that we see in these airplanes. And the antidote to maintenance-induced failures is to use a minimalist approach to maintenance and to do only maintenance that is really necessary and justified, not doing maintenance for things that aren't broken. Every manufacturer provides this long laundry list of time-directed maintenance, things you're supposed to do every 50 hours, every 100 hours, every year, every 5 years, etc. And it's important to understand that those recommendations are strictly recommendations. Almost never are they requirements. Occasionally they're requirements, and we'll talk about when they are, but 99% of the time they're simply recommendations that the owner is free to accept or reject as he sees fit. And generally the manufacturer's recommendations are usually excessive and way over the top because they are based on worst case assumptions. If the manufacturer says change the hoses every 5 years, that recommendation has to be good for the worst airplane in the fleet, the airplane that's sitting, outside on a tie down in Key West and is flown irregularly. And if that recommendation is good for that worst case airplane, it's probably wildly excessive for most airplanes, particularly the ones that are used actively and that are hangared and that are based in Denver instead of being based in South Florida and so on. Many of the manufacturer's recommendations are not only excessive, but often they're detrimental. For example, the manufacturers will recommend pulling fuel injector nozzles and cleaning them on a prophylactic basis. In our experience, you almost never find a clogged fuel injector nozzle except right after maintenance where the fuel injector nozzles were removed, because the nozzles are self-cleaning. They have a very effective solvent called 100 low lead running through them all the time, keeping them clean. And if they're going to get plugged up, the most likely reason for that to happen is because some mechanic opened up the system and allowed some sort of foreign material to get into the injector or to get into the fuel system. So a lot of these manufacturer recommended time-directed items are ones that we will routinely decline because they aren't necessary, and frequently they actually do more harm than good. It's important to understand that mechanics are going to maintain the airplane strictly by the book, strictly by the manufacturer's recommendations, unless you instruct them not to. And the reason is that if a mechanic does not maintain the aircraft in accordance with manufacturer recommendations, if he makes a decision not to do something by the book, and then something bad happens, he's going to be in a very difficult position when you turn around and sue him. And every mechanic is terrified of being sued these days. There's been a total explosion in litigations against mechanics and shops since 1994, which is when Congress passed the General Aviation Revitalization Act of 1994. And so every mechanic these days will do everything exactly the way the manufacturer recommends, unless the owner instructs him not to, and instructs him not to in writing. If you tell the mechanic, no, I don't want you to do this list of items, then your instructions to him are his get-out-of-jail-free card if anything bad happens. But if you don't instruct him to decline an item, he's always going to do everything that the manufacturer recommends, because to not do that will open him up to liability exposure. And nowadays, the explosion in litigation against shops and mechanics have caused mechanics to do a huge amount of defensive maintenance, in the same sense of the word as defensive medicine, where they do things not because they think they're necessary, not because they'll actually benefit you, but because if they don't do that item and then you turn around and sue them, they're going to have a lot of explaining to do in a deposition or on the witness stand. So that's why it's really important for owners to be actively involved in the decision-making process. If an owner is not involved in the decision-making process, the mechanics will typically make decisions to minimize their liability. And the minimizing of the mechanic's liability is not generally coincident with the owner's best interests. Of course, the trick is knowing when to say no and what to say no to. So let's talk about that a little bit. High on the list of things to say no to are the kind of time-scheduled recommendations that we just talked about, that can be performed on condition instead of on a time basis. In other words, instead of doing something every 2 years or 5 years or so many hundred hours, do it when an inspection indicates that the part is deteriorating and that it needs to be replaced. The latter is called on condition, the former is called on time. Condition-based maintenance is always far more cost-efficient than time-directed maintenance, because condition-based maintenance calls for performing maintenance when it's demonstrably necessary, whereas time-based maintenance calls for doing maintenance when somebody's guess as to when maintenance might be necessary, and those guesses are always hugely pessimistic because they have to work for the worst case airplane in the fleet. So they're very likely wildly excessive for the average airplane in the fleet. Consider ignoring manufacturers' time-based recommendations and replacing or repairing only when inspection shows that replacing or repairing is necessary. Engine and propeller TBOs are excellent candidates for this approach. Those of you who have been reading my articles in Sport Aviation or following these webinars know that both of the engines on my airplane are at 200% of TBO, that my props have not been overhauled in about 21 years. I'm a very strong believer in on-condition maintenance, and I practice what I preach. Another thing that's a good candidate to say no to is preventive maintenance intended to prevent acceptable failures. What's an acceptable failure? It's a failure that, if it happens, is not going to cause you to fall out of the sky and is not going to cause you to get stuck somewhere that you don't want to be. Perfect example is the periodic replacement of the TKS anti-ice filter on the Cirrus. That's a $300 or $400 maintenance item that they recommend doing every 2 years. And that's, in my view, it's totally insane. We have never taken out a TKS filter that wasn't absolutely spotless. Why? Because the only thing that ever passes through that filter is pure TKS fluid. Um, basically what I say to the Cirrus owners that I consult with is, unless you have some reason to believe that somebody accidentally dumped a Diet Coke in your TKS tank, there's no reason in the world to ever replace that filter unless the TKS system is starting to act up, in which case it might be worth looking at the filter. But to do this $500 maintenance item every 2 years, that's a $250 a year maintenance item that isn't going to accomplish anything whatsoever. It's just a classical case of the kind of thing we say no to. Preventive maintenance intended to prevent failures should only be done if those failures are ones that are serious. I mean, we do preventive maintenance on magnetos, for example. We send them out for a teardown inspection every 500 hours. Because if you have a magneto failure while you're on a trip, at very least, you're going to be stuck somewhere. At most, you're going to declare an emergency. In some aircraft, you might even wind up making a forced landing. Those are not acceptable. So we take magneto maintenance seriously. But so many of the things in the airplanes, a failure is not going to cause a problem. I mean, say failure of your number 2 comm radio, it's just something you say, well, gee, the number 2 comm radio doesn't work. We'll have to get that fixed when we get home. That's the sort of thing you'd never want to do any kind of preventive maintenance on, because the failure is acceptable. And so the optimum strategy on things like that is to simply run the item to failure and then deal with it when it fails. Vacuum pumps. My airplane has 2 vacuum pumps. I run the vacuum pumps to failure. The manufacturer says replace the vacuum pumps every 500 hours. That's silly. I've got 2 vacuum pumps. The failure of one vacuum pump is an acceptable failure. Everything continues to work because I have 2 vacuum pumps. So why on earth would I replace vacuum pumps every 500 hours? Doesn't make sense. If the failure is acceptable, then the maintenance strategy should be run to failure. Finally, let's not overkill problems. We don't want to replace something if we can overhaul it. We don't want to overhaul it if we can repair it. And we need to be very careful about these words, because words like repair, or IRAN, which is an acronym for inspect and repair as necessary, overhaul, rebuild, all have very, very specific regulatory meanings. And we want to always use the right word. There's pretty much a hierarchy of words here. The one at the bottom is the least expensive, and the one at the top is the most expensive. And anytime we have an unairworthy component, we want to decide which of those 4 things to ask for. And typically, you want to ask for the lowest cost one that will get the job done. When we do have a 500-hour magneto inspection, we never ask for the mag to be overhauled or rebuilt at 500 hours. We always ask for an IRAN, and inspect and repair as necessary. That gives the magneto technician the maximum amount of flexibility to simply replace those parts that he feels need replacing, and to use his own judgment. If we tell him to overhaul the mag, we basically take away his ability to use any discretion. He has to open the overhaul manual and replace everything that the overhaul manual calls to be replaced, irrespective of whether the part needs to be replaced or not from a functional standpoint. So many owners and many mechanics are spring-loaded to the overhaul position. The O word is one of the most expensive words in aviation maintenance and should be used very, very judiciously. And we always ask for a repair or an IRAN unless it's clear that an overhaul is needed. Rebuilt is more expensive. Rebuilt, it means overhaul to new limits by the original manufacturer. So, for example, anyone can overhaul your Continental engine, but only Continental can rebuild your Continental engine. And of course, new means new, and it's always the most expensive way to go. So anytime we have an unairworthy component, we look at this list of words and we try to use the word that's lowest on the list that will get the job done. And it's important to use the right word. These are all terms of art with very specific regulatory meanings. Okay, what things do we never say no to? Well, we never say no to anything, any maintenance task that is required by regulation. And there are three main classes of those things that are required by regulation and are non-negotiable. One is anything called for by an airworthiness directive. If there's an airworthiness directive that applies to something in our aircraft, we have to comply with it. That's not something that can be declined by the owner, because if you don't comply with all applicable airworthiness directives, the aircraft can't be approved for return to service, and it will be grounded. A second thing that we have to comply with because they're required by regulation are airworthiness limitations. In other words, things that appear in an airworthiness limitation section of either the manufacturer's maintenance manual or the manufacturer's instructions for continuing airworthiness. We don't need to comply with instructions for continuing airworthiness in general. Those are just recommendations. But if the ICA has an airworthiness limitation section, then anything in that section has to be complied with because it is it's an FAA requirement required by regulation. The airworthiness limitation section of the maintenance manual or the ICA is the only part of those documents that are FAA approved. Everything else comes from the manufacturer, and the manufacturer does not have the authority to dictate to an aircraft owner what he has to do, what he doesn't have to do. Only the FAA has that authority, and the FAA exercises that authority through airworthiness directives and airworthiness limitations. Now, legacy airplanes that are like mine, that were certificated under the old CAR3 rules, never have an airworthiness limitation section. Lycoming and Continental engines never have an airworthiness limitation section because they were all certificated under the old rules before the notion of airworthiness limitations had even been invented. New design airplanes like the Cirruses and Diamonds and so forth that were certificated under the new Part 23 regulations will often have an airworthiness limitation section. It's usually very small. It usually contains only a tiny handful of items, but those items must be complied with just as if they were required by AD. In most modern maintenance manuals, Chapter 4 is the airworthiness limitation section, and Chapter 5 is the other recommended maintenance. And typically Chapter 4 is only a page or two, and Chapter 5 may be, dozens or hundreds of pages long. And the stuff in Chapter 5 is simply manufacturer recommendations that the owner can comply with or not as he chooses. But anything in Chapter 4, airworthiness limitations, is something that the owner is required by regulation to comply with. And then there are items, discrepancies, that the inspecting IA considers to be an airworthiness item and marks as an airworthiness item on the discrepancy list, as we saw before. An airworthiness item is one that the inspecting IA judges to be not in conformance with the aircraft type design or not in condition for safe operation. And by identifying that discrepancy as an airworthiness item, the IA is basically telling you, I'm not going to be able to sign off the annual unless we fix this. And in general, we say yes to repairing airworthiness items because if we say no, we're going to get into an argument with the IA. On the other hand, some IAs are ultra cautious and call almost everything an airworthiness item. So if an IA calls something an airworthiness item and you disagree, go get a second opinion. And if the second opinion giver tells you that he doesn't think that really is an airworthiness item, then push back. And in the worst case condition, if you are deadlocked with the IA, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, you can break the deadlock by directing the IA to have an annual signed off with discrepancies. We'll talk about that on a subsequent slide. At any rate, getting back to our friend Alan with the $25,000 annual estimate, we wound up going through it and declining a bunch of stuff and coming up with a final total of $8,000. Still a lot of money for a Cirrus annual, and there were some things we couldn't do anything about because the owner picked a very difficult shop to work with. But we did reduce the invoice total by about $17,000. And just quickly, the 5-year flex hose replacement, we declined and recommended that the owner, because the airplane was very active and was hangared, leave the hoses in place to 7 to 10 years, then replace them with Teflon hoses that don't have a 5-year hose replacement recommendation and would probably last for as long as the owner is going to own the airplane. The 5-year fuel drain valve seals, replacing those are silly. You replace those if the fuel drain is dripping. If the fuel drain isn't dripping, you leave it alone. The same thing with the gascolator seals. If they aren't dripping, leave it alone. Aileron rudder shock cord, if they look okay on inspection, leave them alone. When they don't look okay on inspection, that's when you change them. 500-hour alternator number 1 exchange, no. This is a dual electrical system, dual alternator airplane. It's got 2 batteries, 2 alternators, dual buses, specifically so that the failure of an alternator is not a safety of flight item. You fail one alternator, you got another one. So in a case like that, alternator failure is an acceptable failure, so we run the alternators to failure. And so we said, no, we're not going to change them on time. We're going to run them to failure. The propeller overhaul we've already discussed. There's no need to overhaul that propeller at 6 years. And even when the prop gets to an age where it would be prudent to take it apart, we will recommend an IRAN rather than an overhaul, which will cost about half as much as an overhaul. 4-year overhaul of magnetos is totally silly. There's nothing in a magneto that requires replacement on a time base, on a calendar time basis. We always recommend, as does the mag manufacturer, doing a mag tear down at 500 hours, but we don't do an overhaul. We do an IRAN, and typically the cost is will be maybe $400 or $500 per magneto, about half of what the cost of doing the overhaul would be. 2-year main battery replacement. No, batteries should be replaced on condition via capacity check. That's what the battery manufacturers recommend. Doing it every 2 years is silly. These batteries normally last 3 to 5 years, sometimes 6 years. We replace them on condition by doing a capacity check. Don't do it on a time basis. TKS anti-ice filter, as I indicated, is silly. We never replace those. They're always spotless. Fuel injector nozzle cleaning, again, we talked about. We always say no to that. If a nozzle is clogged, it's very clearly visible in engine monitor data. If the engine monitor data shows a small gammy spread, then we know the nozzles are fine, and removing them for cleaning is just silly. So we always say no to that. The prop TKS de-ice boots cracking, we asked the shop to take photos of them. We looked carefully at the photos. The cracking was only cosmetic. It hadn't reached the point where the de-ice boots were at risk of starting to debond from the propeller. They will eventually have to be replaced, but certainly not at this early stage. The lower cowling heat damage, we also asked for pictures. We looked at it. It looked pretty bad. We authorized the repair. Wing root fairing caps disbonding, the same thing. Cirrus, in its infinite wisdom, adhered these things to the aircraft with double-sided tape. The tape eventually starts losing its grip, and we want to replace them before we wind up losing them in flight, so we authorized that. The muffler flame cones were warped. We, instead of approving a replacement of the mufflers for $2,250, we had the mufflers sent out for repair by AWI up in Minneapolis, which is the same company that manufactures them, and the repairs are about half the cost of a new muffler. So we did have this done, but we did it via repair rather than replace, and saved the owner over $1,000 just doing that. The ELT replacement, obviously not yet required by regulation. The owner had an ACK E01, and we recommended that he wait another year until the ACK E04 was available, which was a drop-in replacement for the E01 that would cost him half as much as the ELT that the shop was proposing, and that's what he did. So we saved him another $1,000 doing that. The miscellaneous paint touch-up, we asked the owner if the cosmetics bothered him. He said doesn't bother him a bit, so we declined. And most of the 50 other little squawks we approved. So the bottom line was the total came down from $25,000 to $8,000 by declining those items that seemed like they should be declined. Gives you a pretty good idea of how we manage these annuals. Again, the shop was prepared to do everything that the manufacturer recommends. That's what most shops will do, absent input from the aircraft owner. So if you don't want to be doing all those things and paying all that money for stuff that really doesn't accomplish anything useful, you have to be the one to say no, and typically say no in writing, which takes the shop off the hook for the decision and puts the decision in the hands of the aircraft owner where it really belongs. Okay, at the end of every annual, there is a logbook entry. And there are two different kinds of logbook entries that can occur at the end of an annual. Either the aircraft is found airworthy or it's not. 98% of the time, it's found airworthy, and the logbook entry contains language that comes right out of the regulation, FAR 43.11, with an approval for return to service, and it should contain the following sentence. I certify that this aircraft has been inspected in accordance with an annual inspection and was determined to be in airworthy condition. When you get that logbook entry, the airplane has been approved for return to service and you can go fly it. The other possibility is an unairworthy sign-off, a sign-off with a list of airworthiness discrepancies that have not been corrected. That would occur, for example, if you had a disagreement with the IA and he said, I can't sign off the annual unless you do X, and you said, well, I have no intention of doing X, I think you're wrong, and the way you break that deadlock is to instruct the IA to sign off the annual with a discrepancy. That completes the annual, gives you a logbook entry, you get the airplane back, and now you simply have to get somebody to clear the discrepancy. And the wording for that, again, right out of the regulation, the logbook entry contains the statement, I certify that this aircraft has been inspected in accordance with annual inspection, and a list of discrepancies and unairworthy items dated whatever the date is has been provided to the aircraft owner or operator. That discrepancy list, the discrepancy list itself is not in the logbook entry. It's on a separate sheet of paper signed and dated by the IA, and it's on a separate sheet of paper because it is not a permanent part of the aircraft maintenance records. Under the regulations, that discrepancy list is only part of the aircraft maintenance records until the discrepancies have been cleared, at which point you can tear it up and throw it away. So here's an example of a sign-off of an aircraft that's approved for return to service. This is the kind you see 99% of the time. With the magic words right out of the reg. And here's an example of a sign-off with discrepancies where the IA has given the owner a discrepancy list, and the annual is over, but the aircraft is not approved for return to service because it has some discrepancies. Now, sign-offs with discrepancies are something that is not very well understood by most aircraft owners because they typically haven't ever experienced it. But it's important to understand how it works. If you have an annual signed off with discrepancies, which typically happens when you direct the shop to sign it off with discrepancies because they're trying to get you to do something you don't want to do, if you get the aircraft back with that second kind of logbook entry, disapproved for return to service, The inspector has to give you a signed and dated list of discrepancies on a separate piece of paper. The annual inspection is now complete. The airplane does not have to be inspected again for another 12 calendar months. The aircraft may not be flown because it has discrepancies, but those discrepancies can be corrected by any authorized person, typically any A&P mechanic. In some cases, certain discrepancies are ones that you could correct yourself under your preventive maintenance authority. After the discrepancies are corrected, there is no need to take the airplane back to the shop that did the annual. No need to ask the IA to inspect the work. The minute the IA signs off the disapproval logbook entry, his job is done. He goes home. You get the airplane back. It's your responsibility to get somebody to correct the discrepancies, and it never has to go back to that IA again. Here's an example of a case where the owner of a Cessna 340 had an annual inspection done by Cutter Aviation in Albuquerque, and decided that he wanted to have a bunch of the discrepancies that were found during that annual resolved by another shop in Alamosa, Colorado, which I believe was his home base. So the cutter who did the inspection signed off the annual with discrepancies. The wording that they used was not exactly correct. It wasn't exactly the wording that the reg called for, but it was close enough. And it basically says a list of discrepancies and unairworthy items has been provided to the aircraft owner. And then down at the bottom, they say that they've inspected the aircraft and found it safe for a one-time special flight permit, which is a ferry permit, to fly the airplane, admittedly unairworthy, from Albuquerque to Alamosa to have the work done at the shop in Alamosa. And then the next logbook entry is the one from the shop in Alamosa, Mountain View Aeromotive, that says it repaired the items from the cutter work order, a whole bunch of detail, and signed off. So that logbook entry clears the discrepancies that were itemized by the first shop that did the annual. So that's an example of an annual signed off with discrepancies, and then those discrepancies being corrected by somebody else, and in this case at a different airport via ferry permit. Very important to understand that when you get your airplane back from any maintenance, and particularly from an annual inspection, but this is true of any maintenance, you may not fly that airplane until it has been approved for return to service and the required maintenance record entry has been made and signed by an authorized person. So you never, ever, and we see this happen constantly, and it's very bad. Never accept an IOU for a logbook entry. If you go to the shop to pick up your airplane and they say the airplane is ready, but we haven't prepared the logbook entry yet, we'll do that on Monday. Legally, you cannot fly the airplane until that logbook entry has been made and signed. In fact, you are required by regulation to personally verify that the logbook entry has been made and signed before you fly the airplane. And ironically, if you fly the airplane before the work has been signed off, the shop is not in trouble. The shop could take 6 months to make that logbook entry, and they would not have violated any regulation. But if you fly the airplane before that maintenance record is made and signed, and that you have verified that it's been made and signed, then you're in violation. So never accept an IOU for a logbook entry. You can't take delivery of the airplane, at least you can't fly the airplane, until the logbook entry has been made and signed. FAR 4313, performance rules for mechanics, says each person performing maintenance shall use methods, techniques, and practices prescribed by the manufacturer or acceptable to the administrator, and tools, equipment, and test apparatus recommended by the manufacturer or in accordance with accepted industry practices. So maintenance has to be done either using methods, techniques, and practices prescribed by the manufacturer, or methods, techniques, and practices acceptable to the administrator? What kinds of methods, techniques, and practices are acceptable to the administrator? Well, the administrator has published many advisory circulars providing acceptable methods, techniques, and practices. Notably, one called AC 43131B, which is about the size of a good-sized telephone directory, just chock full of acceptable methods, techniques, and practices. So we can do things the way the manufacturer specifies, we can do things the way the FAA specifies in this big fat advisory circular or any other advisory circular. Now, it's important to understand that the phrase methods, techniques, and practices as it appears in these regulations means how to do something, not when to do something. How-tos are the responsibility of the mechanic. It is his responsibility to perform things in accordance with acceptable methods and techniques and practices. When to do something is not the mechanic's responsibility, it's the owner's responsibility. There is not a syllable in Part 43 about when to's. All of the discussion about when to do things is in Part 91, directed to the aircraft owner. When to's prescribed by the manufacturer need not be complied with unless explicitly mandated by the FAA, either in an airworthiness directive or in an airworthiness limitation section for newly, relatively newly certified airplanes that have airworthiness limitation sections. Otherwise, manufacturers' when to's, TBOs, life limits, inspection intervals, et cetera, can be totally ignored. They have no regulatory significance, and it doesn't matter what words the manufacturer uses. The manufacturer can say mandatory or compulsory or you must. It doesn't matter what adjectives he uses. We never, ever have to comply with manufacturer-specified intervals unless the FAA requires us to do so via an airworthiness directive or an airworthiness limitation. Airworthiness limitations are an exception. They always must be complied with, but you never will find an airworthiness limitation section on a legacy aircraft or any Lycoming or Continental engine or any or most propellers are not affected by airworthiness limitations. So just because the manufacturer says that you have to do something every 500 hours or you have to overhaul a prop every 6 years doesn't mean you have to do it. Those are merely manufacturer recommendations and they have no regulatory impact, and so it's totally up to the owner whether to do it or not. Inspection rules, this is FAR 4315, again directed to IAs. Each person performing an inspection shall determine whether the aircraft meets all applicable airworthiness requirements. What are all applicable airworthiness requirements? They are airworthiness directives, but not service bulletins. We never have to comply with manufacturer service bulletins unless there's an AD that says we do. Airworthiness limitations, but not manufacturer's recommendations that appear outside of an airworthiness limitation section. So the vast majority of manufacturers' recommendations are purely recommendations and not requirements. Compliance with type design and the IA's opinion of what is in condition for safe operation. The first three bullets are all theoretically objective. The last bullet is a subjective one. The IA, you're paying the IA to make a subjective determination of whether the aircraft, in his opinion, is in condition for safe operation. An IA is required to use an inspection checklist, but it can be any checklist he wishes to use. It doesn't have to be the manufacturer's checklist. It can be one that he derives from any source. It can be one that he makes up himself. Part 43 Appendix D defines the minimum and scope and detail of an annual inspection. So any checklist he uses has to at least include the items in Part 43 Appendix D, but those are very, very generic. Um, uh, One of the things I did many years ago as an aircraft owner, long before I ever thought about becoming an A&P or an IA, was to create my own annual inspection checklist for my aircraft and give it to each IA that I had inspect the aircraft and ask him to use my checklist instead of any other checklist. I never had an IA say no to that request. IA is required to do an engine run-up as part of the annual inspection to make sure that all of the basic engine parameters like oil pressure and maximum static RPM and that sort of thing are within specifications. And finally, the last thing we'll talk about very briefly is resolving disputes. If you have, and disputes with a mechanic while your airplane's an annual can be very, very painful and awkward. It's not a good thing to have happen. That's why we don't like to do annuals with shops we've never worked with before, because we don't want any surprises. But occasionally disputes will come up during annual inspections. If that happens, there's basically a three-step routine that you should go to get those disputes resolved. The first thing you should do is attempt to compromise with the IA. Sit down with him, preferably in person if you can. Explain your position and why you disagree with him, and the fact, and indicate that you've done your homework and consulted with outside experts or whatever before taking the position you're taking. Then give the mechanic the opportunity to explain his position carefully and to explain to you his reason for taking the position he's taking. It may be that he has good reasons, and it may be you'll learn something. Try to find some common middle ground that you can compromise on. If you do this with a cool head and a professional manner, most of the time you'll be able to come to an agreement with the IA and resolve the dispute that way. If the IA is sufficiently stubborn that he is not willing to negotiate with you, the next step would be to go and get an expert second opinion. Find somebody whose credentials are impeccable in the area in dispute. If it's an engine problem, go find an engine expert. If it's a structural repair issue, go find somebody who's a structural repair expert, preferably somebody whose credentials are such that the mechanic will respect them, and explain the situation and ask the expert to give you his feelings about the situation, who's right and who's wrong. If the expert agrees with you, ask the expert to call your mechanic and discuss it with him. The mechanic may accept something from a fellow mechanic that he would not accept from you as an aircraft owner. If the expert agrees with your mechanic and disagrees with you, then be prepared to eat humble pie and understand that what the position the mechanic is taking is a reasonable one, and be prepared to agree with it. In my experience as a second opinion giver, and I've been in this position dozens and dozens and dozens of times, probably hundreds, it's about 50-50. About half the time that an aircraft owner comes to me, I will agree with him and I'll go to bat for him with his mechanic. And about 50% of the time I'll disagree with the owner, tell him why he's wrong, and urge him to follow his mechanic's advice. If you get an outside expert's opinion that coincides with yours, and you have the expert talk to your mechanic and the mechanic still won't budge, then the last resort is to fire the mechanic. If it's in the middle of an annual, the FAA gives you an official FAA-approved way of firing a mechanic in the middle of an annual, and that is to direct him to sign off your annual with a discrepancy. That takes the mechanic off the hook. He signs it off with a discrepancy on the thing that he thinks has to be done and you don't think needs to be done. Your annual is done. You get the airplane back. You pay his invoice, and now it's up to you to go find somebody more reasonable to resolve the discrepancy. If you can find somebody on the field, that's all the better. If you have to move the airplane somewhere else, You get a ferry permit. Typically, that's very, very easy to do. We get ferry permits all the time. Typically, you get the ferry permit on the same day you ask for it. It's simply a matter of faxing them a completed form and asking them to fax you back the ferry permit. That's usually a trivial thing to do, so don't be scared of ferry permits. But if you have a dispute with a mechanic, the key thing is to remain calm and be very professional in your dealings with the mechanic. Most owners blow it because they get real emotional, and if they get mad with the mechanic, then the mechanic's going to get mad with them, and everybody's position hardens, and the chances of getting the thing resolved amicably are greatly reduced. So keep it calm. That's also a good reason to get an outside expert involved, because the outside expert doesn't have a dog in the fight, and he's very unlikely to lose his temper with a mechanic, whereas owners, in my experience, frequently lose their temper with mechanics. So don't let that happen. It's always has a bad outcome. Don't be intimidated by mechanics. Aircraft owners are often intimidated by mechanics. No mechanic has the authority to ground your airplane. No mechanic can compel you to do maintenance that you don't want to do. Again, even if this comes up in the middle of an annual inspection, you can always simply break the deadlock by instructing the mechanic to sign off the annual with a discrepancy on the issue that's under dispute, get it out of his shop, and then deal with it with somebody else who's more reasonable. It's really important that the aircraft owner always stay in control of the process. Remember, it's your airplane. You're the boss. The FARs make it clear that you're the boss. The mechanic is a hired help. He is not running the show. You're supposed to be running the show. But unless you act like the boss, the mechanic will do what he sees fit to do without your input. So you have to stay in control of the situation, and that often puts aircraft owners in a place that's outside of their comfort zone. Working with thousands of aircraft owners over the years, it's become clear to me that many aircraft owners are uncomfortable saying no to their mechanics. They often feel compelled to do whatever the A&P recommends. They don't take into account that an A&P's advice is often tainted significantly by liability concerns, and that mechanics frequently recommend doing things not because they're in the aircraft owner's best interest, but because they're in the shop's best interest to minimize liability exposure. Sometimes they feel that their mechanic has them over a barrel. If you identify with this sort of thing, you may want to consider getting a professional to manage your maintenance, because professionals have no problem at all saying no to mechanics. I mean, our guys do it dozens of times every day. That's what we do. And I do understand that although it's really the aircraft owner's responsibility to do this, many aircraft owners are profoundly uncomfortable doing it. And if you are uncomfortable, then maybe it's worth getting a third party to help you out. That's all I have. And why don't we go ahead and go through some questions, and I leave my contact information up here on the screen while we're doing that. So if you have a question that we don't get to tonight, or a question that occurs to you later, feel free to email me, and I'll do my best to respond to your questions. We do these webinars first Wednesday of every month. We've got, I don't know, 15 or 16 of them now that have been recorded, and if you go to the URL at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a list of all of the ones that have been recorded and are available, and those are all links to the EAA webinar site where you can play back the recordings. That's all I have. Chad, you had some questions?
I sure do. Let's start with one that has to do with the amount of time flown in a year. From Terry, he wants to know, if an airplane has only flown 35 hours since its last annual, does the mechanic have to do everything that was done 35 hours ago, or can he do an abbreviated annual?
Unfortunately, um, Part 43 Appendix D defines what must be done at every annual inspection, and everything in Part 43 Appendix D must be done at every annual inspection, regardless of whether the aircraft has flown 500 hours or 5 hours. I wish it wasn't that way. To be honest with you, there are a lot of things that could go, 2 or 3 years, and there are other things where once a year may not be enough. But unfortunately, um, for a piston aircraft and for single-engine turbine aircraft, um, the rules are that we have to do an annual inspection every 12 calendar months, regardless of time. Now, when you get to multi-engine turbines or aircraft that are over 12,500 pounds gross weight, that's large aircraft, the rules are different. Then we have phase inspections, and we don't necessarily have to do everything once a year. But for the smaller airplanes that we fly, the low end of the food chain, all of our airplanes are Part 43 Appendix D airplanes that require an annual inspection every year, regardless of flight time. Wish it wasn't that way, but that's the way the regs are.
All right. With regard to calendar time on an engine, meaning if an engine has a high calendar time, for example, the engine was overhauled, last overhauled 30 years ago, but only has 1,000 hours on it, what's recommended here?
Well, first of all, both Lycoming and Continental have recommended TBOs that consist of a certain number of hours or 12 calendar years, whichever comes first. So the manufacturer recommendation is to overhaul the engine every 12 years if it's a low utilization engine. I consider that to be an absurd recommendation. I recommend that you totally ignore it. The TBOs, of course, have no regulatory impact for Part 91 non-commercial operators. We don't have to pay any attention to those TBOs unless we want to. And certainly in terms of the 12 years, I would recommend ignoring it. In terms of the reason that the manufacturers put in a calendar time recommendation, and this is true both of propellers, where they typically have a 5, 6, or 7 year calendar time recommendation, or engines where they have a 12-year recommendation. They put that recommendation in because they're concerned about very, very low utilization aircraft where the engine might go 50 years before it reached the TBO hours. And they're concerned about letting an engine go 50 years without being opened up because they're concerned about corrosion, particularly on low utilization aircraft. However, nowadays, we don't have to tear an engine down to see whether there are corrosion issues. First of all, we can bore scope the cylinders and see the condition of the cylinder walls without taking anything apart. Second, we can, by a combination of oil, spectrographic oil analysis and oil filter inspections, we can tell if there is excessive iron in the oil, which would be indicative of corrosion damage. So there's no reason to be taking an engine apart just to see whether there's corrosion damage. Nowadays, we can tell the condition of the engine without having to tear it apart. We have non-invasive tools for determining condition. And remember that all of these TBOs were established long before borescopy was commonplace. We've only really been borescoping cylinders on a regular basis since 2003. And the TBOs were established back in the days when engines often did not even have oil filters. They only had screens which only catch stuff big enough to have serial numbers on them. So they simply aren't realistic in today's world. If we use all of the available condition monitoring tools, there's no reason that we need to tear an engine apart to determine whether there's internal corrosion damage. We can tell by using the non-invasive tools. I think that probably is about all I can say on that subject.
Okay, yeah, that's a good question, though. Good answer. Another good question from Hunter wants to know, what can an owner legally do while participating in an annual inspection?
Owner-assisted annuals. I'm a huge believer in owner-assisted annuals. In fact, that's how I originally got interested in aircraft maintenance myself. When I first became an aircraft owner back in the 60s, I was pretty much an appliance operator, didn't have any involvement in the maintenance. And then in the early 80s, I did my first owner-assisted annual and sort of got hooked on it. And look where things progress. So I'm a big fan. The question is, what can an owner do in an annual inspection? And the answer is, there are actually three different parts of that answer. First of all, what can an owner do all by himself with no involvement whatsoever by the mechanic? He can do all of the preventive maintenance that is authorized by Part 43, Appendix A. And in particular, he can do all the opening up and closing. He can do all the preventive maintenance, the oil changes and the filter cutting open and the wheel bearing greasing and all of that kind of stuff. All of that stuff is stuff that an owner can do on his own recognizance, on his own signature, without any A&P involvement. Second of all, he can be involved in any of the repairs as long as the mechanic is willing to act as his supervisor and sign off his work. And the fact that the mechanic is his supervisor doesn't necessarily mean that the mechanic is looking over his shoulder. The amount of supervision that is required is purely up to the mechanic himself. So if the mechanic trusts the owner to do work, the supervision can be simply, go ahead and do it. Let me know when you're done and I'll go inspect your work. So basically, under supervision, an aircraft owner can do anything that an A&P is willing to allow him to do. Right down to overhauling the engine, although I would not particularly recommend that would be something most aircraft owners would want to do themselves. But there's no limit to what you can do. The only thing that you can't do during an annual is the actual inspection part of the inspection, because a mechanic is not authorized to delegate any portion of the inspection. However, he can supervise anything else other than the inspection part of the inspection. Anything that he is authorized to do, an uncertificated individual can do under his supervision legally, as long as he's willing to sign it off and take responsibility for it. But the one thing he cannot delegate is the actual inspection part of the inspection. We run into this, for example, where aircraft owners do their own oil changes, and they'll put the airplane into an annual and say, I just changed the oil in the filter, so please don't mess with the filter or the oil. You can't do that. The inspector is required under Part 43 Appendix D to cut open the oil filter and inspect it for metal at every annual inspection. So doing an oil change right before an annual is not a very good idea. If you do that and you coordinate with the mechanic, he might be willing to have you stick the oil filter in a Ziploc bag and then let him cut it open and inspect it, as he's required to do. But if you change the oil filter and throw the old one away and give him the airplane with an oil filter that has 0-time oil in it, or 1 hour oil in it, first of all, he's required by regulation to cut open that filter and inspect it. And second of all, if it only has 1 hour of time on it, it's not going to have much in it. So it probably defeats the whole purpose of the inspection. But the inspection part of the inspection is the one thing that a mechanic cannot delegate. anything else, he can delegate to you to do as supervised maintenance, as long as he's willing to sign it off.
Okay, sounds good. We have a bunch of other questions here that we probably don't have time for this evening, but if your question did not get answered, please feel free to give Mike your question through email. He'd be more than happy to answer it for you. Any closing thoughts for us tonight, Mike?
No. As I said, I figured that we probably had lots of questions, and for those who didn't get their questions answered because we ran out of time, I'm happy to provide answers via email. So I do encourage you to go ahead and ask the questions via email, and my email address is up here on the screen.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you very much for doing the presentation tonight. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right. Good night, everybody.